Uh, an elective affinity for the humanistic avenue on a certain philosophic amity with grief or anguish. So let's look at this. So we're looking at the Renne Good incident. So I say incident advisedly because I don't want to say either killing or murder. But in doing that, I immediately signal that I've stepped back and that not only am I acting as though this has happened long ago, say in the time of Justinian, 6th century or so, but actually it's as though it happened in another cosmos. But then again, it's said the long deliberations have come to the view that it cannot be that God should step down and that then another God should take his place, because God is supposed to be God, eternity, truth, and so on. What Heidegger's handling in GA 21 in his logic and truth investigation, truth in the philosophic sense, in the sense that it's eternal or always true, is meant to be something that can't sort of abdicate. But nonetheless, to the extent that we're talking about truth and therefore something that can't be sort of like Dostoevsky, talking in the 19th century, said, what if you were on the moon? Would any of this matter then to you? Because nobody could communicate to you. Your past history would be utterly forgotten. There'd have no legal repercussions, etc., etc. It's sort of an exaggeration of the Ring of Gyges thing in Plato. You're invisible. Nobody can charge you, can take you to task for your crimes. But yes, nobody can. It's true, I could use certain terms. I want to use, for instance, in my analysis, the term Boldyke, and then therefore people around Berkeley, Wendy Brown, whoever, maybe Wendy Brown, sort of more like the Boldyke member of the Judith Butler family. That's at least plausible. Then people can get mad at me, and then maybe I have to suffer the repercussions. But nonetheless, the rabbis always argued this point, like, is there really such a thing as genuinely free thought? And then, if there is it good? But let's suppose it's good. So I'm just exercising genuinely free thought as much as possible, and the way I make that a metaphor out of that is by saying, let's pretend this incident didn't just happen on January 7th, which is only a couple days ago. That happened a very long time ago. And therefore we don't have to be too heated about it. So what, Nero committed some terrible crimes a long time ago, but it doesn't really involve our near and dear or whatever. Nonetheless, I think this moment is very temporally compacted with the current moment. So, one, I want to say Vance. So I'm going to give a sort of so-called, I'm going to give an account according to the things, or according to what I think happened, speaking in this guarded way. I'm not going to say according to the facts. And then I'll give a short statement where I'm at the slight odds with what I take to be. I offended Sheehan, I think, because I said I think that his view is due to a certain Catholicity, but on the other hand, maybe he just thinks I'm an idiot. So it could be either way, but it's sort of, there's a in scholarship, you get a situation of Kafka's short story, which is called Gemeinschaft, or sort of community, where it said, and this is like sort of the ruling principle of all these scholarly claques. Like if you have a claque calling themselves the Heidegger Society, World Heidegger Society or something, or if you have a claque calling itself the Knapp Foundation or something approaching we're more familiar with it when we hear of NGOs and especially think tanks, right? Think tanks. The way it works is just like what Kafka says in that short story where he says a prolonged discussion with this person that wanted to enter a group would amount to, in a way, allowing them to enter the group. So there has to be ghosting or stonewalling. But in any case, I've disagreed with Sheehan's translation of a certain passage, but I'll bring that in a second. I want to say, and I'll bring in an account of the my account of the things or what happened. But remember, this is always very, since we're giving a humanistic account, we have to remember something like the Sixth Commandment or whatever, some sort of something like that. The second half of the Decalogue, which deals with sort of crimes rather than the first half, which deals with adulation of Hashem or whatever. And this long confusion over whether it says thou shalt not kill or whether it says thou shalt not murder. So it actually says, in my opinion, it says thou shalt not murder. Because obviously, in fact, Hashem is ruthlessly invoking Amalek, just as... now, I don't think Netanyahu is a Jew according to the Mosaic Code, and of course he absolutely, not absolutely, but he, how did he say, well, not absolutely in the sense that he says, yes, there should be scholars, the Haredi and the Old Orthodox groups from the 18th century and so on, who say the law of Israel should be the law of the Torah, Hashem's law. But, and so that was true under the First Temple religion, but not true, and still true under part of the Second Temple, but not true once Alexander's generals took over, and then Israel became something more like modern Israel. But the original one, David was told sort of by the voice, as it were, by the emperor. I think it's Lucas certainly took over this Book of Samuel version, to kill every last one of those actually it was Saul that was told this, but Saul failed to kill every last one. He killed every last Amalekian, but he didn't kill a goat, I think, something like that, and then therefore he was his body became corrupted, he went insane, and he was superseded by King David. So but nonetheless, this shows the difference between killing all those Amalekians is one thing, murder is another thing. So in a certain way, only human beings can have this, just as I was trying to isolate this position that Goethe calls elective affinity, and say there's something like, also with grief, animals have anxiety, they have fear, they have other emotions, but there's something human that can be isolated according to this theory of elected affinity, which is not, also with amity or friendship, which can be humanistic but not based on Darwinian considerations or evolutionary considerations. But this certainly, if there is a place of purchase in this incident, I think that's where we have to look for it. And so we can't just simply ask, like we're consulting our grandparents, like, oh, you guys got this worked out, right? So like we don't have to work it out. All these legal codes. We want to be able to do something more like, but see how we always get ourselves into this trouble again, more like what the Romans call being sui juris. Everybody should be sui juris, and that means each one has their own law, and it's something like what Kant meant by, Kant gives a very particular version according to German idealism and according to his theory of spontaneous freedom, and in the context of working out these problems set by Descartes and so on, and Hume, of autonomy. But nonetheless, the sui juris of the Romans is kind of like that. Each one should be their own law, and being your own law. So if we had accepted that, which we probably wouldn't accept it, except that it means the true and eternal law should be each of our own law. But then how can we find this true law which cannot abdicate, this unabdicating law? So let's review for a second to get orientation on the way people are currently analyzing it, some of the old slogans. So Samuel Moyn likes to quote this slogan, leges in moribus vani, or law without mores is vanity, or is useless. And I like to quote what I take is basically it intermingles with that principle, but it's differing, is and sometimes it gets confused, is nihil quod est contra rationem est licitum, or nothing against reason is licit or legal. These are two avenues. So one goes to reason, which Hegel and Kant had changed into Vernunft, but which in former times had something to do with ratio and logos. So ratio, logos. So logos, talking about it like we're doing now. And then we talk about it, and then there's something that we regard as, according to Lotz's view, valid, but there's the problem. But what is validity? It's, once you look at it, you come into a lot of trouble. And especially trouble in the sense of really linking the old version of reason to the Vernunft reason, in the sense. So let me give a statement where I came into disagreement. I don't know if it was really that was a disagreement. Like I said, it was probably more because I attributed it to his Catholicism. So Sheenan translates this passage from GA 28 from Heidegger's collected works. GA 21 from Heidegger's collected works 21. Meine Rede ist sachlich falsch. As my speech is objectively false, but I prefer to say much more windily, as it were. But is that wrong? Because the principle of translation is the following: you interpret and then you put it into your own language. So I translate Meine Rede is sachlich falsch. Of course, this is in the context of this whole GA 21, Heidegger's work. My speech is false according to the state of things. So the point is, like, if we give an account of this good incident, this January 7th incident, we are presuming a lot about what our speech is. There's something in this speech, and so for instance, if you're A.J. Ayer, he thinks what one really describes when one sees anguish accompanied by tears, he said scientifically this is, salienated water or something like that. and that if you say anguish accompanied by tears rather than whatever the right scientific way of stating anguish would be, probably to maybe putting it in terms of how is the heartbeat. If the heart's beating at a certain rate, then we can assume certain things, and then if there's some other factors, then that all adds up to what we call anguish, according to a physicalist, according to a definition that goes to the an account, a Popperian type of account that you can observe, an observable Popperian account. But if you, so in the very fact of just observing something, there's not just, that's just an example, but there could be all kinds of different ways to enter into the kind of correctness situation, the situation whether speech correctly says what it's meant to say, on top of this problem of the killing murder issue. Killing versus murder, doesn't that have something to do with whether people are really experiencing grief? It changes the quality of the grief, right? So, if somebody dies because of an accident, it's somewhat different than if they die due to deliberate cruelty or due to something that has a human culpability behind it. But then we say of the situation, of the observed situation, that the culpability is right there in the situation. So I'm just going to say what I saw currently, based on what all these different point of views that we're getting in these videos. What it looked like to me was, so one, there's this allegement of something that happened prior to what I saw, which is supposedly somebody told Renne Good to drive along. I didn't find any video where I could hear that. I kind of think that's probably, there is a video out there where they do say that, but I kind of discounted at the same time, because I think maybe somebody said move along, but when you look at what happened immediate to the shooting, sort of within right when, so sort of from a humanistic point of view, from when all the emotions were heated and then the thing happened, but from a sort of clock time, I guess, there was like hardly 10 seconds, which were really intense. And then the wife, who was kind of a bull dyke, who was kind of like, to put it, it was a man, I would say, like machismo, like, and sort of like Marlon Brando in this 50s movie, The Wild One, or something, like simply somebody who's, it's like, what are you rebelling against? What have you got? But it's that attitude applied to an issue. It's like they don't like authority, like Woody Allen said in a film where he goes to Hollywood and he rips out, the cop gives him a ticket and then he rips it up in his face. They have the terrible problem with authority. This type of person. And then the wife, the one who was shot, Renne Good, is sort of that often happens in relationships. It's compensatory, right? It's a compensatory, right? Big sister, little sister. Kristen Stewart puts it in terms of the relationship of Rosie O'Donnell and I think the woman who plays the catcher in that Tom Hanks movie, whatever, A League of Their Own. But you see that in many forms, like so for instance, I think the sort of the purest example is Rory Gilmore and Paris Geldner in the Gilmore Girls. So Geldner is obviously the machismo bull dyke type, and then Gilmore is sort of less confrontational, right? In that case, I think, but let's not go into that whole. In that case, I think it's less a matter of compensation and more a matter of one is superior and the other is defective in a certain way that makes her secondary. But it's sort of a certain function of certain people to be to be defiant in public situations, whereas other people are often much more. But I think probably to the mean. I mean, some people are timid in public situations, but then I think the mean is to be more like if you look at Kristen Stewart in that Saturday Night Live mock confrontation with Kate McKinnon, it's the same type of thing, but I think you see that the Kristen Stewart version is just more balanced. But that's why I say, to me, the perfect, I mean, I was writing some expos about this, is like, to me, if you have a bunch of thugs with guns around you and then say it's your spouse, you're going to say, you're going to signal that you just want to remain calm. And I mean, you have certain situations where you're dealing with just crazy people, and then you're going to have to act accordingly. But when you have people where you kind of think if you placate them, probably they're not going to hurt you. That's just a direct sense. You can sense that they have guns. Yeah, just placate them. That's what you do in a situation like that, to me. But then you have this this couple. So what the people are talking about is really there was a couple, and they were double teaming that guy. And so I think that guy let's forget about the second two shots. The first shot went through the windshield, so he was in some way in front. And apparently he had an earlier incident where somebody like almost ran him over, which isn't surprising because he does this sort of macho thing, sort of Tom Hardy. You remember when Tom Hardy played that villain in Batman, who was kind of like holding his hands in his vest, sort of, and strutting? He had a sort of strut where he strutted around the vehicle. So he had been hit by a vehicle before, I think. And I mean, I think I read that. I could be mistaken, but I think I actually read this. I'm not just inferring it from his behavior. So he was probably hypersensitive about it, or like once hit, flinched twice or whatever. But I think it was also because, the wife was instigating it. And then here's the thing. I think if Renne Good had just been on her own, okay, she probably would have just pacified the situation. I think it was because there's like what some people aren't bringing out, though it's right there, is the wife shouted, "Drive, baby, drive." And then there was like 2 seconds or something passed, and then boom. And so it's like, if you're, drive, baby, drive, and then the whole situation's tense, and then she's hitting even, so the, yes, if you were like us, regarding this as something that happened 1,000 years ago or whatever, if you weren't actually there, it's easy to say, well, look, the wheels are turned. Well, he didn't know the wheels were turned. She's turning the steering wheel. Yeah, he could have seen that, except he was looking at her face, trying to, shouting at her, get out of the car, trying to make eye contact, trying to be heard. So maybe he didn't even, it all happened very quickly. And then plus he's being heckled by the wife. Now, I mean, the whole thing is obviously a disaster, but I think it has a lot of elements in it. But what I'm trying to get to is, how should we analyze what's happening here for principles of law, for the true principles of law. Not, I'm much less interested in, except that it reflects on our analysis what the current law is, what the positive law is. Although that has an effect, because it affects the way people act in this situation. So J.D. Vance taking a hard line towards defending the so-called law enforcement. I mean, there's a lot of sort of poly-origness here. I don't think I think there's legitimate different events here are happening. I mean, prove to me there's only one event. I know you have some footage on the camera, but fuck you. That's obviously not true, because everybody is talking about it and they're all saying different things. So we have a different situation that's ever happened before, where these things are happening on the camera. So Zizek has been talking about that quite a bit, and with regard to the breakdown of public mores, but and politeness and comity and so on, but also with respect to Netanyahu and Likud and all that. That it's happened, the genocide's happening on video. But I suppose even that is a totally different stage than remote antiquity, the archaic period, when it's not a question of whether it happened on video or not on video. It's a question of Amalek. And it's sort of like nobody is saying, oh, you're committing genocide, that's a terrible crime. No, they're just, it doesn't even, it's not part of the debate. So actually, it's a different situation where people are reacting and moralizing, or being trembling in indignation, or being righteous. My intention was to say that in both the appreciatory and a higher way, but I'm not sure if I was able to say it in a higher way. So Vance is saying self-defense, right? I think the thing he says that's interesting to me is that he says the part of the, as it were, the larger causality, not just the proximate causality, but the larger causality is not just what it, I mean, actually it was what immediately happened. But he's saying part of the causality of, I mean, it was me that just threw in that proximate versus legal dichotomy. But part of the issue is, according to him, radical leftism. But I'd say this does, we could superimpose that over the fact that this was a lesbian couple, and feminism, extreme sort of jagged arrow feminism, this sort of Kristen Stewart. Kristen Stewart does it as not as somebody yelling at police officers, but as somebody giving interviews. Okay, but you can see sometimes she's with, in effect, she's Rory Gilmore, and she's with some sort of Paris Gellner type, who's more sort of, I mean, somebody who didn't like Hillary Clinton. I remember at the time of the first debates, referred to Hillary Clinton as with Trump as bot Hillary, because she's sort of like a tack dog. So, yeah, somebody who is more of an attack dog, and somebody who is more of a thinker and more of a ruthless and vigorous and sharp in their words than they would be because I think because Kristen Stewart would be um, more sober somehow in that situation. Just because if you're a little bit reflective, you kind of realize, um, yeah, it seems there's a point where, just what I've already said. I mean, there's a point where you're calling the guy big boy or whatever she said. You can get away with that, but there's a point where like there's thugs with guns, and you just don't want to. It's just not sensible. It's foolishness. There's a point where you're in a 1950s movie where nobody gets killed, and you could sort of say, um, you know, these Marlon Brando lines, and be tough with the police or whatever. But then there's the other point where you're in a 1950s movie and you're a black guy in the South, and then you're going to get lynched if you do something like that. And it's sort of like people know that it's part of the specifically human thing. It's different from animal life. So I think that should be taken into consideration. But again, I'm just looking at this from the point of view of kind of trying to set up a case study to ask, how could we arrive at laws? So let me just say something about how we've arrived at the situation we have with respect to the law, and sort of in connection to Heidegger. Heidegger is using this near and far language, which sort of rhymes and echoes with the their Fremde concept and Simmel's stranger concept. So Simmel says the stranger is the synthesis of nearness and farness, and he says, so the stranger is someone who say in They Live, the figure that Zizek identifies as the itinerant construction worker or whatever. It's usually by proportion more crimes are committed by people, strangers and outsiders, by the way, because for the obvious reason that then they jump on the train, they're gone, and they've gutted somebody or something like that, and they're more likely they could get away with it. Whereas if people are in an embedded community, people know one another and so on. So in the situation of the itinerant worker, Simmel's point is, here's somebody who's sort of, what their strangeness amounts, what their being the stranger amounts to, is that they could leave at some point. It's sort of like they're open to leaving the community. They're sort of open to leaving. But I think what Heidegger's ultimately, so here's what happens is, you have communities, so in the sense of common law, in the sense of, so for instance, the Doomsday Book looks all at the beginning of the 11th century or so, after the Norman invasion. It looks around, they're looking at different, who owns what property and stuff like that, but they find out all about the local laws and thousands of cases of local law, and that becomes the basis for the so-called common law. How do people handle legal situations in various localities? That's the basic for the common law, also for, once upon a time, for the principle of jury of your peers, which no longer exists. But jury of your peers meant really that people that are kind of like you in their socioeconomic situation, in their locality and so on, would understand your situation better. It's less a matter of what it's now sort of presented as though it's just a jury of generic citizens as against the government or something like that, a jury of your peers, rather than being judged simply by judges or something. Okay, so you have local laws and then think of that as also laws of peoples, like so you had in Aristotle's time, Aristotle wrote like 100 constitutions or something, but each one of those Hellenistic policies, though they had different local sets of laws and so on, they also had enough in common that Aristotle could write those 100 constitutions and kind of put them all in the same terms, and sort of they could all understand each other. Whereas the Persians had some different notions, education of Cyrus and so on. And the point with Hegel, but also with Kant's essay on cosmopolitan intent, is this time of the different mores is over. So I think this more links up with what Moyne likes to quote. This quote about law without morals is useless or defunct or whatever, or vain. And then the other side is the one that I like to quote, which is more linked to the reason or logos. But this has also fallen prey to, it's sort of the fact that people say Fukuyama is wrong about the end of history proves that also they don't believe in reason. Because the point of Hegel was the last gasp, where he's saying some other people, the French and so on, are saying a few people through pure reason can't. Well, I guess Kant is the pure version, but they were also thinking of the French, the categorical imperative, which is meant to say only in this respect can pure reason be active to divine what the autonomous law is, according to Kant. Whereas in everything else, it's better to go with the senses, or with experience, or whatever, however, with the phenomena, let's say, the things, I would say, rather than the mere objectivity. So long story short, what this means is the interpretation of the Enlightenment by the Germans is basically reason has failed. So Leo Strauss put it this way: the judge had to judge the judge, and the judge turned out not to be a wise judge. The failure of Kant's system, and then the comedy of Hegel's sort of silly claim to have solved the problem which nobody believed. So in other words, if Hegel is claiming his own time as the end of history, and he's proved it through this dialectic of the various tragedies and the various so-called world historical individuals, such as Socrates and Napoleon being the last one, according to him, the world spirit on horseback, as he saw riding through Jena, and who he interviewed in person, I think. Did Hegel meet, Goethe met Napoleon in person. Did Hegel meet Napoleon in person? I don't know. But in any case, I think he just saw him riding by on his around the time of the Battle of Jena. But in any case, this notion that one side the laws must be, then this is actually the side Hegel is taking, the laws have to be an expression of the people. And on the other side, the law can be this abstract rash statement derived from pure reason. Both these have fallen apart, and I think in a way both these, on the one side, one of them is like the positive law, or in another form, Huntington and realism, so-called realism, which presents itself as though it were always like a theory available because it can be projected back on antiquity. And on the other side, this notion that through talking about things we could discover the truth, and then of course various syntheses of this. But what's the big point here is that this moment of realizing everything is caught in this. So let me say again what that means is, it's not that there's no any longer sort of like you could point to the local mores of Japan as though Japan had no contact with the rest of the world. Because like Mishima has put this sort of bluntly by his image of Japanese at the time of Admiral Perry, and again in World War II, were forced to look in the mirror of the Americans, and Japanese sociologists who said, yes, now we recognize ourselves as one culture alongside others, part of no longer the monoculture, but even the term monoculture is alien to a genuine monoculture. Just as in a certain sense, if you're a Sioux Indian or whatever, you don't have this notion of playing different roles. You just are what you are. Whereas if you're an Athenian Greek, you have this notion of the theater and of ethnopoetic practice, and of maybe we should have this maybe women should run the city instead of men. So then you think about that with the play, the assembly women. And then identity is already somewhat scrambled. So Westerners, we have that for going back into the second millennium BC, whereas other countries don't have that. And to extent also, I think, well, in any case, I was almost going to say maybe Russia has it slightly less, although Russia reveres Plato, I think, more than the current West does, even if we're the fragmented remains of it. But in any case, what I want to say is there comes a point where the awareness of the other cultures and the awareness that one is from a culture becomes so direct that there's no longer a culture there. You're no longer really just as Americans, Americans are less likely to identify as Americans. They're sort of like Johnny Depp says Americans are stupid or whatever, and then he goes to France or whatever, as though he weren't himself an American. There's a situation where appealing to the mores doesn't work because there's no longer, the theory of cultures itself has sort of like destroyed the fact of being a culture. And since law is so much a matter of an expression of the people over the ages, summa ratio, and if not the people, at least of case histories by the judges. Whether the judges are regarded as part of the people or not is part of the problem. And of course they were for Socrates, otherwise he wouldn't have allowed himself to be put to death. He could have run away. But of course they aren't largely, even in our own time, a lot of people sort of recognize the legal system inwardly, but then a lot of people don't, and then there's a confusion about it. I think what Heidegger is saying is, with respect to this situation where the stranger is the one who maybe they're not going to stay in place, I think we should let's do something on that more exactly in the next one, maybe. One, Heidegger puts unheimlich, or the uncanny, in the place of Thalmasine, or wonder. And I think part of what the unheimlich has to do with is that we're all, Americans as Americans, and Westerners as Westerners, are in this fremde situation where there's a synthesis of nearness and farness. There's the possibility of leaving the current dwelling, and in a certain sense the current dwelling isn't manifest. I mean, all the talk about that, the law is it was always like this, there's never a law or whatever, is sort of a symptom of the farness, of the remoteness of the law in the Kafkian sense, the alienation. Okay, I mean, if people don't really think that ICE, for instance, are officers of the law, then that indicates, even though they're right here, that indicates a remoteness. There's not, there's a lack of Heimat, there's a lack of being at home in this situation, and there's something that could move away, but it's fundamental. It's sort of like, it's fundamental in a way that's close to the, perhaps, so I think the accelerationism and even the technological essence are slightly less in the closest closeness in der Nähe for Heidegger, and this very problem of the Unheimlichness as the strangeness of the human being is even closer, but it has partially, and for us, it has something to do with this revelation that we have no ethos, and we do not believe in reason.